Ladies and gentlemen, just a small correction. I'm not really going to talk that much about Second Life, but just first off, a show of hands. How many of you have actually used a virtual world, been in there yourself? Yeah? How many of you, having been in, go in regularly and stay in there, or was it just a one or two sort of times to experiment? So we don't have many regular users. Okay. Well, everyone, I guess, has heard of Second Life. I mean, Second Life was probably the virtual world that put the whole thing on the map, although I have to say it is not the biggest, it is certainly not the most successful, and it's probably one of the worst environments for learning in. Having said that, there are actually hundreds of virtual worlds, and what I would like you to do is to forget about that, because the big mistake that most organizations make is to actually get fired up with the technology and start making decisions about the technology and then try to retrofit what they're doing into that technology. And the inevitable result, as is often the case, is things don't go as planned. If we go back to academic research in both sociology and anthropology over the last century or more, it is quite clear that we know that technology succeeds when it meets a need that people care about. Technology succeeds when it meets a need that people care about. The problem that we have as technologists is we can do all sorts of things. That does not mean that we should. It does not mean it's necessarily a good idea. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. So just because we can do things in a virtual world does not mean that we automatically should. The challenge for organizations is determining when and where, and then ultimately in what. But the challenge that we face first off is to get over that cool factor. I mean, virtual worlds over the last couple of years have been cool, and therefore people are diving into them and thinking, we're going to look really good by doing all of this, and it's called cutting-edge stuff. And unfortunately, it goes downhill from there. So forget cool. Cool doesn't cut it when you're actually talking about using virtual environments for serious purposes. The first question you therefore need to ask is, what need are you trying to actually fulfill? What is the purpose of what you're doing? Then you could start to actually determine whether a virtual environment, a 3D environment, as opposed to some other learning or collaboration environment, actually makes sense. The decisions about technology are going to come much later. Now, I said there were several hundred virtual worlds, and there are new ones arriving almost on a weekly basis. I no longer actually try to keep track of them individually because it's fairly pointless. The majority of them, probably 80% or more, are targeted at children. And whilst they have value if you are in the educational sector, you can use them to some extent for teaching, and there are learning experiences in there, and they allow children to socialize and so on. They are essentially learning through play, and the successful ones, it has to be said, are generally speaking commercially inclined. I mean, they are designed to actually support some other commercial product. So, these are the modern equivalent of the kids' magazines. 20 years ago, if you had a Barbie doll, then you would have been a member of the Barbie Club and you'd have had your monthly magazine. Well, now you actually go to Barbie Girls and Barbie World, and you've got your three-dimensional Barbie, and you're doing all sorts of things, and so on. And one of the real reasons that these worlds are so successful, and they are very successful, the most successful virtual worlds in numbers on the planet, are actually children-oriented ones. And they're successful because they're very tightly focused, they know who their audience is, and they're about a very close-knit social community. If you go to Barbie Girls, then you can be pretty certain that the first person you meet there will also be interested in Barbie Girls, Barbie dolls. And therefore, you've immediately got something in common, you can talk to them, and there's a relationship starts to build up. That is one of the big things that is missing in many of the adult-oriented social worlds. So, if you move to the ones that everyone knows about, the open social platforms, things like Second Life, the one that really brought it to everyone's attention. The problem with Second Life is that, who is it targeted at? Well, Philip Rosedale, a year or so ago, I was actually in the same room as he was, when he actually said, well, until we have space travel, Second Life is targeted at everyone on this planet. Now, you don't have to be a marketing genius to realize you cannot appeal to everybody. And one of the big issues with Second Life is knowing who's it for. You can go to Second Life and you will meet a lot of people. But the probability is none of them will be interesting. None of them want to meet you. It's like going down to Leicester Square. And if you stand there long enough, pretty much everyone you want to meet and who's interesting to you will pass by. But it will take you a long time, and it's not going to be a very fulfilling experience. So, it's not the best environment for actually socializing. It's not the best environment for learning in because, there are real problems with security. There are problems with identity and access control. There are a lot of distractions. There is a lot of the bad things, the pornography, all those sorts of things on Second Life that have given it bad press as well as good press. It also faces a huge learning curve. You can tell the newbies in Second Life because they're the ones bouncing off the walls. Now, I'm male, and therefore I cannot multitask, as my wife constantly reminds me. And frankly, I find it too confusing to actually cope with an avatar as well as present. And I've presented using virtual environments at virtual conferences. And it requires two people. One person almost to drive your avatar. Now, Ron's an exception. He can do these things, but I can't. One person to drive your avatar and one person to present. And then one person to actually get the feedback and do all of these sorts of things. So it becomes very complicated. The avatar can get in the way. And we'll talk about that a little later on. So you've got problems with identity. You've got problems with access control. Second Life does not work through corporate firewalls very well at all. It's a 50 megabyte or more download, so the client is nasty as far as your IT manager is concerned. There's problems. It's not a particularly enterprise-friendly sort of environment. There are then a whole raft of enterprise-focused virtual worlds. Second Life is not focused on the enterprise, it's just focused on everybody, as I said. And, what do people do in Second Life? Well, they basically hang out. Now, they might hang out together, they might sort of start up businesses, but, if you still believe that you can make money inside virtual worlds, then, you are probably mistaken. One or two people have, but the vast majority of people do not. It does not work particularly well for e-commerce. There's all sorts of problems there. You've got enterprise-focused virtual worlds, things like Forterra's Olive system, which Ron will be showing shortly. Quack Forums have got an environment. Protosphere have got one. There are others. And they provide many of the same sort of facilities that a Second Life does. They're avatars, you have a three-dimensional environment, you can move around, you can communicate, you can show people things, and so on. You have more control over who people are. You don't have the distractions, you can control the environment, you allow only certain people in, you have control over who is who, and you can identify who you're talking to, and who's been in a room, and which courses they've done, and all of those sorts of things. They're better for working inside a corporate environment. They're friendlier to the IT department. So they have advantages, but they still require time. You can't expect to take any of these virtual worlds and just pick them up and go. It's not like going to a web browser and expecting to just pick it up as you go along. You are going to have to spend some time actually getting used to it. Some of them are better than others, but there is a learning curve, and that learning curve is becoming a problem. Then there are the games. And I deliberately include games because you cannot actually exclude gaming, online gaming, from virtual worlds because it's part and parcel of it. So things like EVE Online, things like World of Warcraft, now you might say these are all distractions, they're not sensible, this is game stuff. But the reality is these are very, very good simulation environments. If any of you have ever been involved in business school simulations and so on, this is like business school simulations on steroids. And the skills that you learn in those sort of trading environments are transferable into real life. And there are reports, IBM has produced a report that pretty much legitimized this sort of area, that shows the skills that leaders actually learn, management skills, team building skills, communication skills, and so on, decision-making skills, if you like, that they learn in online gaming environments can be transferred into the corporate environment. And particularly in today's geographically dispersed, relatively virtual organizations. Then there are also, and there's good examples of this as well. The skills that you learn, be they driving skills. My son recently learned to drive and passed his test. I was a little concerned because he'd spent a considerable amount of time crashing into everything at extreme high speed. But his driving instructor said he had very good spatial awareness, and he understood about steering. He just had this problem with feet being disconnected because he wasn't used to actually using foot pedals. Everything was done from the hands. The US military have found that these sort of environments are very good for teaching trainee soldiers to pick up the skills they need to survive in the battlefield and so on. And then there are the serious games as well. And serious games, what do I mean by that? Games that have a business sort of purpose. And there we're talking about sort of simulation environments, so you can have the sort of the what-if scenarios, where you can experiment and play with things which would otherwise be impossible. So, in disaster relief, for example, what happens if I do this versus this? Well, you can find out in an interactive environment without actually condemning half a population to starvation or whatever. So there are some useful applications for simulations coming out of that. And simulation is something that goes back in the computing environment for a long period of time with things like Flight Simulator and so on. So the question is, having some understanding of the breadth of the characterization of the games, how do you choose what sort of, or the environments, how do you choose what to actually go for? Well, the first thing I would say to you, don't choose it too early. That's the first lesson to take away from this. The second is to think about what you are trying to do. If location and context are important to what you are trying to teach, then a 3D avatar-enabled environment will help. Because the relationship between one individual and another individual and the environment and what is going on and what things they see and how they interrelate and so on is part and parcel of the learning experience. So if context and location are important, then 3D virtual environments make sense. And the successful area that we're seeing inside enterprises, and most of my work is focused on enterprise usage because that's where our client base lies, is in those simulations and training environments, particularly where they involve expense, danger, or whatever. So if you want to do a multi-agency disaster planning, for example, you can't actually simulate very easily or at low cost a biochemical incident in the centre of London without actually incurring all sorts of problems. But you can in a virtual environment. Is it as good as doing the real thing? Probably not, but these are artificial environments and it does help. We find, for example, oil companies using these sorts of environments for helping to train people how to get off an oil rig in the case of emergency. It's too late when it actually happens. People need to know how things work. And therefore, if location and the three-dimensional arrangement of things matter, then three-dimensional virtual worlds are a real bonus. And they are working. If you are talking about predominantly social interaction, then virtual worlds, I think, are a complete... Well, no. Virtual worlds are less successful. The body language is problematic. You cannot actually accurately portray the body language of individuals. And the difference between a smile and a grimace is very, very small in terms of the facial movements. But it's very, very difficult to actually make an avatar smile or grimace, which is why avatars in Second Life dance when they're happy, because it's easier to do that than try smiling, because a smile comes across as a grimace, which is a 180-degree switch from the emotion that you were trying to get across. And here's where we fall, again, back into academic research. You get into what's called the Uncanny Valley, whereas the avatar representation gets to be more and more realistic, it becomes more acceptable until it plummets. And it's only then when you get up to 100% realism and the human brain can no longer tell the difference that the acceptance goes back up. Examples of that used to be the Polar Express, the film, where the characters were definitely a little bit creepy. Far better than that is Beowulf, more recently. If you've seen the film, they are very creepy. They're not real, but it's not quite cartoons. Cartoons work really well, and most of the successful 3D or virtual worlds are actually 2.5D and use cartoon sprite-like avatars. Works particularly well with children because they can actually quite happily associate with cartoons. But you run into problems with realism, particularly where it's about getting over social interactions and body language. On the other hand, if you are then talking about content, and this is a virtual environment being used for collaboration or for the development of content, then what we are starting to find, and this is something that really has only come out in the last 3 or 4 months in the conversations I've had with clients of ours who are using virtual worlds, is that the 3D environments are actually somewhat counterproductive. It's like, for many of you I'm sure remember the early days of video conferencing. Video conferencing was cool, it was new, so you all got into the video conferencing suite and everyone waved at everyone else. And it was all very exciting. And then 10 minutes later, you're all heads down actually working on the content. And no one actually bothered looking anymore because it wasn't adding to the experience. Nowadays, we've got telepresence where you can actually fool the human brain into thinking someone is on the other side of the desk. But anything in between is probably counterproductive. So if content is the issue, if you're actually talking about a virtual meeting, a project meeting where people are working on a PowerPoint or a document or whatever, then in fact the three-dimensional environment kind of gets in the way. And what I'm seeing increasingly is a number of organizations who've been very positive about virtual worlds, and I'm positive about virtual worlds, but now starting to pull back and starting to say, well, we can use video conferencing or WebEx or a whole range of things to do this. And part of that is being brought about by the current conditions. As Vaughan mentioned, I mean, the current restriction on travel and limitations that organizations are placing on travel mean that organizations are increasingly starting to look for new ways of actually teaching, for new ways of collaboration, for new ways of people interacting without physically having to jump on a plane and travel. The problem is, and that is good for virtual worlds, that will actually accelerate the uptake, and it will also encourage individuals who are generally speaking fairly conservative and organizations who are generally speaking even more conservative will encourage them to try things they would not have otherwise tried. The problem is that when you are back against the wall and you have to get something done, that is not the time that you are about to spend learning how to do something. Then the user experience gets in the way. That's not the time when you're up against a deadline, you've got to get something completed, that you want to spend 10 or 15 hours learning how to drive your avatar around the scenery. That's when you want to spend that 10 or 15 hours actually getting the job done. So, those familiar tools that are less high-tech start to come back into their own. Now, this does not invalidate virtual worlds. All it says is there are some applications where they don't work as well as others. And the important thing is recognizing what does work, where location actually matters and context matters, versus what does not work as well at this point in time, which is where content actually matters. So in a year or so's time, 2 years, maybe we will get a graft of people who are more familiar with a virtual environment, the PlayStation generation coming in, for example, and we will start to see people having virtual meetings. But they've kind of lost their cool factor, and now people just want to get on and do the job. So in the future, what we are likely to see, and what we're starting to see already, is an increase in what I describe as browser-based virtual worlds, where you can literally just go to a web address, and you are in a simplistic 3D environment. It doesn't require a significant client installed on your computer. It doesn't have the same sort of graphics requirements. It doesn't require powerful computers. It doesn't use as much bandwidth. It doesn't give you the richness. It doesn't give you all the 3D development tools that Second Life does. And they are good, don't get me wrong, I'm not against Second Life. Second Life is widely used because it is essentially easy to get into. It has some very good 3D building environments, it's just not a very good learning environment. So we'll see more browser-based worlds coming in. We will see people actually starting to use 3D environments and virtual collaboration without the 3D environment much more over the coming year. But the cool has gone. Cool doesn't survive in a recession. So what actually matters to enterprises is content. If that content is about location and it's about interaction, then it is best served in a three-dimensional environment. If it's purely about theoretical content, whilst it might be very interesting and cool and so on to have that meeting, if you want to talk about the molecular structure of a protein, for example, to have it in a model of the protein, as can be done. I mean, you can be big scale or nanoscale in virtual worlds. That's one of the big advantages of them. But it becomes a bit of a distraction. It's cool, but it doesn't help you actually move forward necessarily. So people are moving back to a somewhat simpler environment. So, to summarize, and then I'll basically open it up to questions. I mean, ask yourself what the need is. What are you trying to achieve? If content matters, then start to look elsewhere than three-dimensional environments at this particular point in time. You might end up saying, well, content is only part of it. We need the locational stuff, and therefore 3D is going to work. But ask yourself that question. Virtual worlds are not the answer to every solution. If location actually matters and context matters, then 3D makes a heck of a lot more sense. There are generational issues. If you're trying to teach and educate an older workforce, then in fact the generational issues come into play. They are less likely to be comfortable and familiar with avatars than your teenage children, for whom driving an avatar around on their PlayStation or Xbox is second nature. So there is that question of familiarity. Now, that's not universal. Most gamers, for example, the average age of online gamers, the serious online gamers, is in their late 20s. These are junior middle managers, and they're spending a lot of time in this environment. So it's not automatic that anyone over the age of 25 can't use virtual worlds, but it's something that you certainly have to think about. And finally, start looking out there at what platforms are available and how much you want to spend and what organizations are there to actually help you do that. But that is absolutely the last decision that you need to make, because the market is changing all the time. And if you start making decisions too early about which platform to use, then you start locking yourself in. No one likes to admit they made a mistake, that they made the wrong decision. So you start trying to retrofit something to a platform that is not necessarily ideal. And with that, I will finish and throw things open to questions. I'm more than happy to try and take